Welcome back to the Living Hope Podcast. This week we have Pastor Emeritus Tim Young with us, and co-host Ethan Goonewarden is on vacation, so we got a new co-host this week, Jacob Deem. Jacob, say hi.
Hi, great to be here.
We're going to jump in a second, but we're going to open up with more broad questions. How's retirement, Tim?
That's different. I was enjoying it, sort of getting into the groove. There are things I enjoy doing. I enjoy visiting people in the hospital, things like that. And my neighbor was very sick. I was visiting him a little, and then all of a sudden everything shut down because of the pandemic. And so we're stuck in the house a lot. We go to Connecticut and Maryland when we're allowed to visit our kids and our grandchildren. But it's being home a lot, and my wife can find lots of things for me to do, and stuff to continue to fix in the house. So that's what I'm doing. Plus, I'm going to another church, West Valley Presbyterian Church, and we're in a small group. So I preached there once. So trying to, my wife joined the church, so I can't join the church. The Presbyterian church, the pastor can't join the local church. We're a member of what's called the Presbytery, and so that's the way it is. But I did preach twice since I retired, so
That's nice.
and did one funeral. So other than that, it's hard to evaluate because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
What's normal.
Has West Valley been doing like online sermons and stuff? Have you been watching them?
Well, they were when we first when I first retired, and we were planning to go there. Everything was online, and then they went to services in the parking lot where you parked your car like a drive-in movie. And now we're inside. A lot of people come. A lot of people stay at home. So, but it works. We keep our distance.
Yeah, that's good. Kind of what we got going right now.
Yeah. The same thing in a way, other than they have pews and they can't arrange the chairs, so they have to mark where you can and can't sit. That's how they do it. But it works.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll get into the first question. So my first question, not necessarily applying to the sermon, but for the process of, say, this week Pastor Tony was on vacation and couldn't preach, what's sort of the process for finding somebody to fill in? Like, who decides who's going to come in to fill in?
Right.
And just what's it like? Do you have to kind of gauge what type of church it is before you fill in and write your sermon? Or
Yeah, well, for Living Hope to find somebody, there's usually, from Presbytery, there are ministers who don't have churches, are retired. There's connections in terms of who they ask, and you tend to ask people who have been examined by the Presbytery, and you're not going to come in and say something wacky. As far as for are you talking about for me, how it would work for me being? I was asked. I'm assuming because I had been the pastor, and for me, what I did is I was preaching a series on David and didn't get to finish it. So when I was asked, I just figured I'd continue that on, and that's how it works. Because I know next week they're asking the stated clerk of our presbytery, Tim Krazan, and he worked for DuPont all his life. He was a scientist, I think a chemical engineer. So, but he was examined by Presbytery and qualified. Asked questions. What do you believe? What do you believe about the Bible? And now at Living Hope, we were a little flexible. We did not. We would allow somebody to preach who hadn't yet been licensed by the Presbytery.
Yeah,
we knew them because we wanted to give them a chance to get up there and fail a little and get over the nervousness. So that's one of the things that we had done. So,
and speaking about nervousness, did you get nervous this week coming back to your old church, haven't delivered a sermon for a while? Did you get nervous?
Yeah, I did. Well,
beforehand?
I got nervous when I was doing this every week. I had recurring dreams. Tom Bonanno, and he told me he has a recurring dream about being a waiter, because he worked as a waiter. Those dreams like you can't find your class in school, and it's and I had dreams I'm locked in my office, I can't find my sermon, and when I retired, I stopped having those dreams, And then when my wife asked the pastor, the elders at West Valley if I could preach, and they said yes, 2 days later I had that dream. So I was nervous, you know. Charles Spurgeon, there's a story about Charles Spurgeon, a great Baptist preacher, where he had a young man come and preach, and the young man went up into the pulpit with his chest pumped out like he was going to conquer the world, and just blew the sermon. It was bad. And he came down like with his head dropped down, and afterwards Spurgeon said to him, "Young man, if you had gone up into the pulpit the way you came down, you would have come down the way you went up." So that humility, that nervousness of what you're doing, you're preaching God's word. And so it's for me, it's always been intimidating because I have to be on top of it. I got to really be excited about it, and I got to work through that. Every week you got to work through that. Tim Keller once said, a pastor can never get sloppy. You have to always wrestle into the presence of God, because say you sin on Wednesday in some great way with you fighting with your wife or doing something, you have to preach on Sunday. And a lot of times if you're not, you can let that slide and get sloppy. Pastors can't do that. And so for me, there was always that battle. And I went through that. Luckily, I got to preach the week before at the church I'm attending, so I was a little used to using my voice. But yeah, it's intimidating in a way.
I can imagine it's a lot different than like performing like music or theater and stuff, because what you say definitely has bigger consequences because you're like the face of the church and stuff. So it's a bit different.
Especially now it's recorded, you know, because I was thinking, I mean, my kids, Elder Scott sent an email to my kids, "Your father's going to preach." And I didn't really think about that. And I did mention my kids, but did I say something embarrassing or you say something about a public figure? I mean, I told a story in my sermon about a woman in my father-in-law's church. Well, she's still alive. I didn't use any names, and just about everybody's gone. But afterwards I thought, should I have done that now that this stuff goes out on air? Even praying in the church, but could you pray for my brother? And you pray for this guy, and you get sued. You know,
I didn't even think about just the prayers being public.
Yeah, it's an intimidating thing. And then preaching, you know, because I tend to tell too many personal stories. You know.
So, we don't mind.
Yeah,
that's why we're excited to have you on the podcast today. We're excited about you. So I have a question about your sermon now. As you said during your sermon, it's good for Christians to understand other perspectives, and yet many of us Christians, we're so sheltered that we don't understand the other perspectives. So how would you say, as Christians, we can learn about other cultures more? Because, we all know the Christian stereotype, doesn't know the other cultures, homeschooled, whatever.
Right.
So how do we break that and actually learn about all these other cultures and yet still remain Christian, of course?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't remember saying that, but for all the 30 years or 40 some years I was preaching afterwards, I would say, "Pastor, I was really blessed by this," and I'm thinking, I don't even think I said that, you know. But sometimes we make those connections. So, but I'm trying to think of the context of this in terms of understanding other people, because the sermon was on sentimentality, which can be, making decisions, treating people the way you feel rather than according to the truth. And the thing is about that is you do need them. You treat people you don't know, you're going to go by sentiment rather than by truth. And I think one of the ways is to know as much as you can about other people. Our neighborhood has changed, so we're getting lots of neighbors, various ethnicities and lifestyles, and my wife and I are challenged to get to know them and not think we already know about them, what their lifestyle is, what they believe, to talk with them. And I think what's going on in our cult prejudice is judging people, prejudging them without knowing about them. So I think we as Christians, we have an obligation to know people and to not just state things, these things that everybody believes, but there's not necessarily true in fact. So I think Christians are to, and one of the things I said is we solve our problems with sentimentality with truth, God's truth, but also the truth about the situation. And then when we deal with people, we deal truthfully in love. Because another thing that I think is a great downfall for Christians is being brutally truthful without love and without consideration and concern. I mentioned about young people coming to Christ, and then their parents, maybe they were raised in a sort of a mainline dead church, or they don't go to church at all, and they come at them gangbusters and are preaching to them in a disrespectful way. Yeah. And I think that we just have to know people, try to know and understand people, listen more than anything.
Yeah, understand their cultures for sure.
Yeah.
Where they're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, people are, it's just like, talk about the difference between the American and Hispanic culture in terms of time. American, if you're there 1 minute late, everybody's upset, and then 2 minutes after it's over, they're all gone. But in the Hispanic culture, they come 20 minutes late, but they're not late, and they stay for hours, A whole different culture. And if we don't know that, then we're like, well, those, what kind of, so then you're judging someone from another ethnicity because they didn't follow some of the norms of your culture that aren't important.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you discussed sinful sentimentality and how it can cause problems like it did with King David. So how do we become sentimental, or why do we become sentimental? You talked about how you fight it with the truth. Is it caused by sort of like a perversion of the truth, kind of a false worldview?
Yeah. Well, I think if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, they would have their feelings always would have followed truth, and they would have never treated one another or anybody in a wrong or selfish way. But I think because we're fallen, and even when we come to Christ and we're redeemed, we still have what we call the remnants of sin. And so we're made by God to be rational and emotional. Emotions are good. God's given them to us. But everything is to be worked in the balance in terms of the way God has created us. As fallen creatures, we are selfish, and so therefore the way we will proceed is ways that serve us best, and the things we want and the things we need. So there are times when truth doesn't serve me in what I want to get done or how I want to proceed, but feeling does. And so then I fall back on my feelings and convince myself that that's the truth or that's the right way to go. And I think that's one of the ways that it happens. And people are different personality-wise. Some people are very emotional, and other people are. They always say, a Scandinavian won't cry if you cut his foot off. And I grew up in a church on, this is ethnicity, but half of my church were Italian Catholics who were converted. And culturally, they were very emotional. And the other half of the church were English and Welsh. Very unemotional people. Yeah. And it caused a lot of problems in the church. I mean, we'd start singing like Power in the Blood, and I couldn't get the Italians to stop singing. And the other church where the Welsh people were, I'm supposed to be there in 5 minutes to start. I had 2 churches, so I had to be down there. So I have to leave, and they're still singing, and then I'm late, and then I tell them, well, we were singing, and they were praising the Lord, and they're upset about this because, and you would think, yeah, praise the Lord, they got saved. No, they made you late, and so even differences in personality, culture, make people approach things differently in terms of, say, emotions versus reason. And I think we live in more of the age of Aquarius, was going to be, now it's going to be feeling and touchy-feely, and rather than rationality. And the 60s was like that. You ever watch the movie Woodstock?
No.
I mean, that was when I got out of the Navy, that was the world I got into. I listen to it now, I'm embarrassed by the things they say because they are so foolish. They're based on feeling and just a wrong view of the world and the way things operate. So, anyway, that's...
Yeah. And does sentimentality, especially nowadays when I feel like the culture is a lot more emotional than reasonable, does it ever become a problem in the church? And, what forms can it take in the church?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's say like on the elder, we call the session, when we meet, we can't be driven by emotion when we make decisions. However, I've struggled with that as we're dealing with issues, problems, say with a family or an individual person. I've known them a long time, and I really like them, and have really messed up, and that can affect then. We need to do this. We need to move to the next step. Like, we need to confront this person, or we need to tell this person, look, you won't repent. And Jesus said, tell it to the church and treat them like an unbeliever. And then it depends on that. Here's somebody, I'm ready to treat them as an unbeliever at the first step, and the other person after the 3 steps, I still don't want to do it. And that's an issue. And I think in the church, it's typical what we call legalism or self-righteousness. Is people are judging one another by somebody dresses a certain way, somebody says something, shares something, they hear about a sin in their life. And one thing about the church is everybody's got different sins, and you hear somebody struggling and they confess they're struggling with a sin, and the other person's disgusted by that. I'd never do that, Yeah. Well, they're making an emotional response then rather than a thinking response. And I think most self-righteousness and legalism in the church is driven more by sentiment and emotion than by reason, in terms of what's right and what's wrong. I mean, legalism is making things wrong in the church that Jesus doesn't say are wrong. Mm-hmm. And the Pharisees did that. In our culture, it used to be, don't go with, how did it go? Don't drink, smoke, or chew, or hang around with girls that do. That was the old statement.
That. You said that.
And so it's wrong to take a drink. Well, the scriptures don't say it's wrong to take a drink. It says wrong to get drunk. Mm-hmm. How about movies? And my wife grew up in a church. You couldn't go to movies, and women couldn't wear slacks and all. And this just isn't. Now it's a different form today. Is it all right to have a tattoo? I've gotten asked that by parents in the church whose kids wanted to get a tattoo. I don't. I was in the Navy for 6 years, and I don't have a tattoo. Yeah. But back then, a tattoo said something different than it says today. And that's a lot based in the Old Testament, where the Jews were not permitted to mark themselves. Mm-hmm. You won't find, in strict Judaism, you won't find tattoos. Yeah. You won't find welfare. You won't find a lot of things in the Jewish community. I'm sounding anti-tattoo. But I don't want to come across that way. But I'm saying that's a hot topic today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've dealt with parents and said, you have to think this through. Why are you against this? Mm-hmm. Is this a hill you want to die on with your kids, or is this just a family rule, or does it say thou shalt not in the Bible? If it doesn't say thou shalt not in the Bible, then you got to decide whether you want to die in this hill, alienate your kids, and 10 years from now when they're not going to church, you ask why, and they say, well, in our house you made things wrong that Jesus doesn't say are wrong, and we just didn't want to be part of it. So we have to be careful.
Definitely. So talking about like the legalism, you talked about discipline a little bit, House, during your sermon. I want to talk about church discipline a little bit. If you, don't say names because we can't use that. But have you ever had to like kick someone out of a church over your pastoral career? Has it ever happened to a point? Because you've been preaching a while, so I assumed it has happened. I just wasn't around.
Yeah, I was in the Primitive Methodist Church for 7 years, and there was no such thing as church discipline. In fact, most churches don't practice it. The Presbyterian, evangelical Presbyterian churches tend to practice it. Yeah. And I was 5 years in Scranton. I planted an OPC church, and we never really had to go that far with the discipline. But here, in my 30 years here at Living Hope, we did. Yeah. We did have to excommunicate a few people. When people join the church and I go over the vows, I say the fourth vow says that you agree to submit to the discipline of the church if you go wrong in doctrine or living. And I tell them that doesn't mean that you go to a movie or your wife's wearing jewelry, or this is serious sin over time that you will not repent of. And if you proceed, and that procedure is that a brother comes to you or a sister, and then two, and then you won't repent over reasonable time, that the elders will come, and the result may be that you're put out of the church. Don't say that it's none of your business, because you make it our business when you take those vows. And so in cases like that, so I tell them, look, in 30 years, we have disciplined 5 people and excommunicated 2. Now, hopefully that says to you that we're just not looking to discipline people.
Like 30 years.
But we also will do it if we have to. And it's hard. I never wanted to do it. You end up losing people in your church over it. And one of the reasons is that the people you're disciplining have friends, and they're telling their side of the story, and the session can't tell their side of the story, and then the session comes out looking like a bunch of bums. And but we learn to put that in God's hands. We can't control that. The bottom line is not to throw the person out, but to redeem them and win them back.
Yeah, because hopefully they come back.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
I mean, Paul, there's a woman in the church in Corinth a man who is living with his stepmother. And Paul says that is such a gross sin that the pagans frown on it. Put him out of the church. Now he writes the second letter to him, and he says, that man sinned, you put him out of the church, he's repented, let him back in the church. So you see that balance in the scriptures. We live in an age where people don't believe that you have any right to discipline anybody or to judge anybody. Like to say, judge not. I remember a teenager in the church once said that to me. Judge not, you're not supposed to judge. And I said, well, you just judged me by saying that. We can't
And
get...
he's like, well, you just judged me by saying that, Pastor.
Back and forth. Yeah, you can't get away from judging. Jesus says, judge righteous judgment. The judgment needs to be right and proper and done in the right spirit. Speak the truth in love. And if we can't do that, and always ask yourself, he says, ask myself, have I committed this sin? What are my sins? Deal with your own sins before you dare to go somebody about theirs. So,
Well, while we're talking about things where I don't want you to give names for, so you're talking about knowing everyone's secrets. Well, not everyone's secrets. What are so how hard is it as a pastor to know everybody's secrets and not tell anyone? And do you tell elders and Linda and stuff? Do you have conversations with them about it, or do you truly keep it just to
well,
yourself?
it depends. Somebody calls me and wants to meet with me. They meet with me and they say to me, I don't want anybody. I ask them, can I tell the elders? No, then I don't. But normally we will share with the elders, because I can't carry this all in my guts. And so, and as far as my wife, there are things that I will tell her. I will, as I'm talking, I'll say, is it all right if I share this with Linda? Because it may be something where she really has some experience or knowledge to help. But there are things like, say somebody comes to me, and I'm just throwing this out. Say somebody comes to me and they've molested their children. I mean, believe me, that type of thing happens. I would never tell that to Linda, because she couldn't handle it. And she couldn't see that person in church on Sunday and say hi and not show it on her face that she knows about this. So, and I think one of the gifts of being a pastor and an elder, God gives us a gift to be able to hear some of the worst of things and still love the person. Even if hard things, like you have to call the cops or what, depending on what's going on.
In the circumstance where it's molesting and stuff, would have you ever called the cops and stuff like that, or do you have some kind of oath where you, like the Catholic Church, where you can't tell?
Yeah, the
people?
confession of the Catholic Church, they're not allowed to. But there's actually a law now that if you are a required reporter. And so somebody reports something to me, I have to report it or I break the law. And there was a period of time when that wasn't the case, and then it was sort of gray. And when it was gray, that's when I would get in trouble, because you report it, and then the people hate you. You don't report it, and then the lawyer, and I've had to deal with lawyers.
Oh yeah.
And the lawyers care about getting a person off. They don't care about having the truth come out and the people deal with the issue. And I've had to try and deal with that, and your hands are tied. I mean, I was once in a situation where I was asked to testify. The lawyer called me and said, "What are you going to say?" And I told him what I was going to say is the truth, and they wouldn't have me testify. So those are the types of things you face in terms of your conscience as a pastor. And I have to realize that I'm living within the church, and the legal world is going to do what they do, and maybe I can make an impact there, maybe not. But in the church, we have to deal with it, and you have to deal with it in love.
Oh yeah.
You have to. as I said there, I mean, one of the reasons you don't just tell everybody, I tell people, like, you're going to give a testimony to the church, don't stand up and spill your guts in front of the church about this. There are people in the church who can't handle it. There are people who say, who were sinned against in this way, and they won't be able to handle it, and you will cause them to sin in terms of how they feel about you, how they treat you. This isn't something you tell everybody. We had a rule, and that is, it was a rule from the Navy, and that is need to know. If you don't have a need to know, don't tell them. So, you know.
One more question before we end this segment. So how do we, if we see somebody, whether it's sentimentality or something else wrong with a brother or sister in Christ in the church, how do we approach that? How do we approach them, first of all? I know you talked about there's a degree of, I guess, self-evaluation, you know. Don't point out the speck in someone else's eye. Well, there's a log in your eye. But say you get past that point, how do we approach that, confront them, bring it to the...
And I think one of the things is that you typically need to have a relationship with the person. If you just come to the person you have no relationship with, though sometimes that you may have to because you're the one who knows about it. So I had people come to me and say this, and I say, why are you telling me you need to? Well, I can't do it. I said, you're the one that has to do it. It's hearsay for me. You're the one that saw it. You're the one that knows about it. But I think that if it gets that serious, you go to the brother or the sister and you tell them about it. Now, they may say you don't have a case. This isn't true. Well, then it says bring one or two others. And I think one or two others who know the person, may even know the situation, but they're trustworthy. They're not on your side. They want to get to the truth. And they come to the person. And they come to you and they say, no, we've talked to them and we don't agree with you. We don't think this is that serious. We think this is a brother who's struggling with this sin. It's a besetting sin they're going to struggle with probably their whole life to some degree. And sometimes they go a little too far, but they're willing to repent. And I don't think we should take this any farther. Then it's over. See, and that's one thing. So another thing you don't want to do is you see it and go and tell somebody else. And that's what people do. Or at a prayer meeting, I used to hear this in my first church. The women a lot of times would say not the women because there weren't any men there. In the Primitive Methodist Church, the men tended to not, that they weren't in leadership, so they tended not to come to things. But the women would say, "Oh, I want to tell you so we can pray intelligently," and then she's gossiping, about somebody. And guys can do it too. So those are this is that you see this. This is between you and that person. Don't tell anybody else. Deal with it. And it may end with that person then. And I think that's the way to do it. You do it humbly, and you do it cautiously, and you do it prayerfully. There are people who just love to get in. I knew a guy in Allentown. His uncle was Harmon Killebrew, who was a great baseball player for, I think it was Minnesota. And he was a pastor. And he had a man in his church who had the spiritual gift of rebuking. And he said it was just terrible. Because he was ready to rebuke. I have a good friend like that who's pretty quick to just jump on you right away. It just makes people resent. It makes people not want to be around the person. They're not going to take that person's word seriously. But if they know you care for them and you're humble and especially honest about your own sins and struggles, they're much more willing to listen, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, that would be my advice as to how to go to the person.
Back. So just jumping right back in, kind of involving on my last question about approaching a brother or sister in Christ who is found guilty, I guess, and approaching them with their faults. You said that one of the keys to fighting sentimentality is honesty, and that's kind of how we should approach a brother and sister in Christ in this, much like Joab approached David. Why can it be so difficult to be honest with people like this? I know, definitely from personal experience, it's hard to not want to, I guess, hurt somebody's feelings, which I guess can be another form of sentimentality. So why is it that it can be just so difficult?
Yeah. I think there's two things going on with sentimentality: is you don't want to hurt them, and you want to be liked. One of the things I appreciated about Tim Keller is he shared once the failures that he had in the ministry, and some of them were mine. And I said to my wife, see, I'm in good company. And one of them was wanting everyone to like you. I don't like to tell people hard things. There are people who love to. They just tell people hard things all the time. But there's a time to do it, and it's hard because I think one of the things is the person. I don't want the person to be mad at you. You don't want to hurt the person's feelings. Those are all things that are sentimentality. Those are your feelings about it, not the truth. Like you said, you go to somebody who's guilty. Well, you're going to somebody who you think is guilty. The guilt has not yet been established, and that's another thing going on. You're second guessing yourself. Well, maybe when it comes down to the day you're going to do it, well, maybe it's really not that bad. I'll talk to a couple people first. Well, you're not supposed to talk to a couple people first. So it all that is going on, and I think you got to really love that person and have and I say you have to have a relationship. That means you can't go to somebody who you have a bad relationship with. Well, maybe you have to, if you're the one that is seeing this. But if you're the one that's seeing it in a person that you don't like, I think you even have to be double cautious, because the fact that you don't like them can cause you to see something that isn't there, or see something that is there but in a wrong light. The seriousness of it or whatever. There he goes again. That's what happens when we don't forgive, and then it moves into what you call resentment. Resentment is the thing that makes everything they do now wrong. Well, you're in church and they walk in, oh, there they are, wearing those clothes, or there they are. Everything they do is wrong. When I did marriage counseling, and that, it's done. They're squeezing the toothpaste tube in the wrong place. That's not the problem. It's another problem that you haven't dealt with that has caused all these little things now to become big problems. So I think when you're dealing with people, you really got to examine your heart. The more you like them, the less apt you are to do it, because you don't want to hurt them. The less you like them, the more apt you are to do it, and do it wrongly. So.
Do you still do premarital counseling? Is that something you still would do, or not? Seeing as you're
I haven't. I will be involved in a wedding in December, I think, but I'm not doing the counseling. I'm stepping away from all of that. One of the things that a former pastor has to do is get out of the way. And I've talked with Pastor Tony in the session about that. I want to be as invisible as possible. I happen to live in the same town, the same area. That can make it more difficult. But I think the less people reconnect with me in those ways that they need to connect with their new pastor, the better. Because there have been a lot of, someone gave me a book about the new way is that the old way was the pastor had to leave. The new way is, why can't the pastor stay? This is his church family. I read some books about how it worked, but most of it is even if they just, people have a tendency to go to the old pastor and ask him, what do you think of this? And then he has to say, I'm sorry, I don't want to comment, but he's not going to do it. Their sentimentality, oh, they still love me, and I need to speak. Truth is, keep your mouth shut. Tell them, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about this.
That's one of the big reasons we started the podcast, was because we wanted to get more in touch with Pastor Tony, because we don't know him as much, and we want to get to know him more, both religiously and just about his personal life, which is why we're about to hit you with a skit we like to call Desert Island. This week with Pastor Emeritus Tim. So you're stuck on an island. You're in the Navy again. Your ship is sinking, Captain. You're on the island. But, you had a chance to save 3 movies. What 3 movies did you save, Pastor?
Oh, gosh. So you're supposed to say the Bible, the 10 Commandments, and Ben-Hur, That's the proper answer. But I've seen all those many times. What movies? Gosh, I like intrigue. One of my favorite movies is Ronin. I don't know if you've seen it, but I like that type of intrigue. But movies with a deep message. Man for All Seasons is one of my favorite movies, about Thomas More and the position that he took. That might be in there. Also, if my wife was there, I'd have to have a Hallmark movie just to end. But God, this is a tough one, because I got a million movies. I'm a movie, you know that from my sermon illustrations. Oh gosh,
And what's your favorite Hallmark movie?
Well, there are actually a couple. They've done some good ones, and some of them, they begins, and I say to my wife, they're going to get married. You already know how it's going to end. But there's one with Henry Winkler where he meets this guy in the airport who is, and he brings him home to his niece. It's really a charming one. There's another one about a Vietnam veteran or a veteran who comes to this town because somebody sent him a letter, and he connects with that family. And then there's one about the son gets killed and he comes back in the form of someone else with the family. Those are really some really good movies, but for the most part they're very formula. And they're, one time I criticized my wife. I said, the world's not like that. And she goes, that's why I watch them.
Yeah.
I don't watch these movies that rip your guts out and I can't sleep for a week, But as I said, Man for All Seasons is one of my all-time favorites. And you're asking me for two more. It's going to be hard. As I said, Ronin. Every movie, a great movie you can watch twice, maybe three times.
Yeah.
And they're really good. But then after a while, you're sort of quoting the guy before he says the stuff. But you'd ask me books, that'd have been a different story, I have to come up with one more movie. What am I going to pick? I don't know. I'd have to only take two.
That's funny because that's what Pastor Tony did as well.
Every week he goes there too.
Yeah.
Runs in the church.
Yeah. And if I had a little more time, on the way home, I'll be thinking, I should have said this one,
Oh man. Well, that's been Desert Island, the usual skit. Now get back to the serious stuff. Where was my question? Oh yeah, you said love is not self-serving in your sermon a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
How do we as Christians act on that? That love is not self-serving. It's not about us. Because I was also thinking about how back to being sheltered and stuff. I don't want to keep repeating myself with that, but you're taught to stay away from bad influences. Like this kid does drugs.
Right.
You don't want to hang out with him. But so loving him isn't self-serving because he might be a bad influence on you. But we should still love him and we should still include him to hopefully have a good influence on him. And do you have any advice on stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, you're homeschooled, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't. I went to Catholic school and then public school. And then I said my dad's barroom and then the Navy. I was exposed to the world a whole lot. And it was destructive, really, in a way, because there was no gospel or anything to guide me at that point. And I think that ultimately you're going to start rubbing elbows with the world, whether you get a job or, I mean, my experience has been, I know somebody who gets a job and they don't like the cursing, they quit, they get another job, they don't like, they just don't like these unbelievers they have to work with. Well, that's the world, unless you, Hackman's Bible bookstore's gone, you can't get a job there. So you're gonna have to work with people, and I think you have to develop a friendship and get to know people.
So do you think it's better for parents to keep people from that till later on, but then you're an adult and you still don't understand these things, or do you think it is better for kids to be allowed to hang out with bad influences so that they can learn about it early? Well, how do you feel about that? With your kids, if you were living in modern times now.
With our kids went to Christian schools, but we lived in a neighborhood and they had friends in the neighborhood and they played with the kids. We had one kid, single mother, and he would curse, but he wasn't allowed to curse in our yard. He'd get mad, he'd go right across the border and start cursing, then he'd come back in. And so my kids hanging around with them, they sort of knew that. Now, going to Christian school, their friends are the Christian school kids. And even in the neighborhoods that we live, they didn't necessarily have friends in the neighborhood, like in Emeritus, because their friends were all from, say, Lehigh Christian Academy. But they did get, I think when they were smaller, you want to protect them when they're smaller from getting into things they're just not old enough to know. I think one of the things our culture does is introduce kids sexuality and all this stuff through movies and video games before they're emotionally really ready to process it. And that's a damaging thing. So we tried to control, we didn't let our kids watch MTV. and we control that. Then they were 16, they got jobs, the Golden Corral, CVS, and then they're working, and they're working with unbelievers and getting to know them. And so we weren't going to say you can't work there, there are unbelievers there. So they needed to interact with that, and then see. My daughter has a really big heart, and she just, people with troubles just gravitate to her. So she was always, her heart was breaking with people, their parents are alcoholics, or all that. She still, to this day, she works for Trader Joe's, and all the young people come to her for counsel. So I think that when in that type of situation, you go to college, Jake, you're going to Penn State, you're going to meet unbelievers. You're going to have. My daughter was in East Halls, Life Halls, where the kids signed a thing they wouldn't drink and use drugs, but her roommate wasn't a Christian, and her roommate made it very difficult for her for about the first 6 months. But my daughter just loved her. Here's an issue. My daughter calls me up and says she was in it wasn't RUF, it was some Christian fellowship. I forget which one it was, and she said, "How do I deal with my roommate?" I said, The girls that I'm hanging around say, "Oh, we know her. We know what gets her. We know how to get back at her." My daughter called me and said, "Is that what I'm supposed to be doing?" And I said, "No, you're supposed to love her and be kind to her." And so that's what my daughter did. My daughter actually went and helped her pick out her wedding dress. She became her friend. But it takes, you got to put up with a lot of baloney to do this. So that's how she handled it on the college campus. Because eventually you're going to have to, unless you're completely shielded, where your parents have a Christian business and all your customers are Christians and everything, you're never going to have to rub elbows with an unbeliever. You're
and
gonna.
That's actually not the Christian thing to do, because you want to evangelize.
Yeah.
So it's really impossible.
Yeah, and you're not going to get. And the last thing people want to do is feel used. You develop a friendship with them just to present the gospel.
Yeah.
You develop friendships with them or relationships because you want to get to know them, and you'd like to present the gospel, but you're not going to do it in its unreasonable way, because that's the ultimate. That's what I got to do, and I got to do it as quick as possible. When I worked for Western Union, I was a troublemaker, and then I got saved. And my father-in-law said, "Well, now you have to make amends and apologize," and I had to apologize to my foreman, And then I started getting to know some of the guys I work with who I used to make fun of, who I used to pick on and play, how do I do that? Start talking with them, finding out. And I found out this one guy, his brother was a minister, and he has a son on drugs. And I found that out as I talked with him. I could have cared less before I was a Christian. So, that's how I handled it. And there were even people use me. The one guy who would want to talk to me about the Bible and everything, and then I'd find out he was just playing me, wanted to make fun of me. And that was all part of it, And even how you work in terms of an example. Do you go and you do more work than anybody else when you're in a union and there's a reasonable amount of work that everybody should do? And I had to till my father-in-law said to me, "Stop doing 2 machines a day. You're expected to do 1. Your coworkers are not gonna, and that's not gonna be good for them, So it gets complicated. You're witnessed by how you work. You're witnessed by your concern for them. I had real long hair and a big beard, and the guys I work with make fun of me, call me a hippie and everything. And when I got saved, I cut my hair off and began to heal those relationships. Then I went to a Bible college, and they made me cut my beard off. And 3 weeks later, there was so many parents complained that they let you have beards. Now my beard was gone, but even those were issues. I had an uncle who I really respected, who had been a war hero, and he died of cancer, and I was asked to be in his funeral, and that's why I cut my hair off, out of respect for him. So I began to think, as a Christian, these are little things that you can do that show respect without overstating it and acting self-righteous, and you can act holy and you can act friendly. People will see right through that. You have to pray that you really are authentically reacting and interacting with people. Say making 1 or 2 really good friendships that you work at is a lot better than trying to have 20 people. So that's my advice. Personalities are different. You may be a quieter person or a more outgoing person, but the world is there, and you can't stay away. You want to be you want to be Amish. Even they can't stay away from the world. They got drug problems and everything else in the Amish.
Yeah.
So, one day you'll be a parents and have to deal with this with your kids, and then you'll understand your parents' heartache.
Anyway, so you mentioned kind of more specifically college kids. You go off to college and you've kind of seen on Facebook and like social media kind of just a completely different worldview from like what they've grown up with. How do we kind of draw the line between reason and feeling, especially with like the current social, political, all the conflicts that are going on right now?
Yeah.
How do we draw the line? Because I think of like, we talked about it a little bit off air, the Black Lives Matter movement and like what's going on in like Portland. How do we draw the line between like reason and being like, this is injustice, this is terrible, like this should change, versus say, I guess just a total emotional response, shut everything down, everything's terrible, we need to rethink everything, blow it all up and start again?
I mean, blowing up and all this anarchy will really lead to terrible, terrible things. They say there's one thing worse than bad government, and that's no government. So, I mean, I'm not a political expert in regards to this, but the one thing I think as Christians we're to keep the law. If somebody breaks the law, that's wrong. But I also like to try to get in behind it in a person's head. Why are they doing it? Yeah. I tell people this sometimes in terms of what's going on in their life. I said, this is not an excuse, but it's an explanation. In other words, why did the person act like that? Well, they acted like that because of these things. It's not an excuse. What they did was wrong. But we understand why. See, it's like I would never do that. But you look at the things that are going on and where they got there. I mean, see, I deal with this I deal with this even in terms of say the reaction to slavery, and you're looking back at the during the Civil War and before then, and people had slaves. Jefferson had slaves, and they judge them as terrible people because I would never have slaves. You don't have a clue what you would have done if you lived then. You might have been really bad if you lived back then. I mean, a lot of times the people who are saying that, you look at their personal life and they're terrible to people in their family or whatever, but somehow if they had been living then, they would have been nice to.
The same thing with Adam and Eve. Everybody's like, oh, well, I wouldn't have eaten the fruit.
Yeah. And quite frankly, God put them in as perfect representatives, and what they did, we would have done, and that's how we're guilty in them. They were perfect representatives who did exactly what we would have done. But I think understanding. I mean, as I said, should we tear everything down? I think things have to be fixed reasonably and in order. I mean, let's say what's going on in Portland. You have a riot, you have gangs, and ultimately that's just going to create chaos and destruction. Somehow there's some order has to be brought into there to get to the solutions.
Ethan and I, we've actually been to peaceful protests during this whole thing, because obviously we feel like the Christian thing is like we're mourning the loss of these brothers and stuff. So we have been doing like the peaceful protests. There was one in Allentown actually by Rose Gardens. I'm not sure if you knew about that and stuff. So there's so many different lines people are drawing about what is good and then when does it immediately become bad, because there's such a big gray area there nowadays.
And there's a price to pay. I had somebody talk to me. I had the Black Lives Matter signs and everything. I can't believe what people are yelling as they see me in that. And I said, look, there's rednecks everywhere. And like a redneck mentality. They're not going to think about it. And then they're going to respond in that way. And if you're going to do this, then realize, there's going to be repercussions. Are you ready for them? And there's a price to pay for certain kinds of protest.
Yeah, like Palmerton, like there were protests up in Palmerton, which is obviously a largely redneck area, especially in the valley. And I know there was some violence happening from the counter protesters. Cause my older brother was actually at some of them, and like there were some like Confederate flag, like some people even had like Nazi banners, and like fighting back. So it's a slippery
Yeah.
slope from
Yeah.
protesting to causing violence to getting attacked. There's a lot of stuff happening.
Well, you're going to protest in Tamaqua or Palmerton. Palmerton was a zinc. They were zinc miners and railroad. Their roots are really blue collar union, and you know, a lot of people don't think. They aren't thinking. They aren't. Well, they went to high school. What kind of education did you get in high school? Perhaps they're, you know, IQ wise, they're not geniuses. They're average IQ, and they got a job. They're carpenters, bricklayers, plumbers, mechanics. They live in that world. And you go with your buddies, and everybody talks this way, and you don't really think it through. Then you go to college. Hopefully, they're going to make you think. Now, when you go to college, they're indoctrinating you, and they're being indoctrinated in a really leftist view in a lot of colleges. So they're coming out with a college education, and you're not thinking any clearer than these rednecks in the bar who are thinking on the right wing. You know, I would say there's a right now I'm getting satellite radio for free. Every once in a while I'll do that. POTUS is the name of one of them. And that's supposed to be a nonpartisan approach. And it's not nonpartisan, but the snide remarks. And I'm looking for a newscast that would just give you the facts and talk about it unemotionally, reasonably, where they're wrong, where they're right. You can't find that. And so then we wonder why you have these factions where
everybody's hating that.
yeah, people are protesting and people are hating the protesters and nobody's talking. And that's the culture that we have right now. I personally think, you know, come out with this, but I think our president has really create. I mean, he gets on and he just brags about himself, and he says he's like a adolescent saying things about the other. You know, you want maturity and you want balance.
Powerful man in the country.
And I mean, it is just a shame that someone like that has an opportunity to accomplish so much, but he can't because he can't get out of his own way, because he's an egomaniac and he's spoiled in a way, and that's just a crying shame, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, well.
Yep. And bouncing off of that, we actually have a fan question. And by
yeah,
fan question, I mean it's from my dad, but still. So just a reminder that you can, if you're listening and you have any questions for whoever we have on at the time, in the future it'll be Pastor Tony. But anyway, so kind of relating to that.
Yeah, don't give my address.
Yeah. So what other emotions can get in the way of our? My dad said theology and morality, but I think it's more centered on morality in this instance. Something like anger and like what we were already talking about, like race riots and whatnot. How can anger kind of cloud judgment and reason, and not just anger, like other emotions?
Yeah. Well, since we mentioned that we have emotions because God created us with these emotions, and in their proper way they protect us and help us. But anger isn't always sinful. Jesus was angry. He overturned and cleansed the temple. He had an anger that was proper. Most of the time our anger isn't righteous anger. You know, we get angry about things. Maybe we're angry about things, people done things that probably should be done, but we're angry because of our understanding of it, or our misunderstanding of the truth and the way things should work. I think being angry about, I'm angry about the way our president talks and the way he communicates. He comes on, I don't want him to talk about we've done more in the world than ever been done for the, you know, I want him to he doesn't have to blow his horn. What he's done is a matter of record. People can see that.
Say what he's going to.
So I'm angry about that. Now what, you know, should I, you know, go down and surround the White House and, you know, try to throw a bomb, you know? I mean, anger that makes us sin is wrong, but anger that makes us want to do something about a wrong, you know, that's one of the things that anger can do. I mean, it's an emotion that helps us, you know, deal with the psychology of things. And I mean, there are people who they never get angry when they should, and then there are people who get angry all the time, and they get angry about things they shouldn't get angry about. I tell this with parents. Parents, you send your kids, if you are not consistent. One day the kid you know, does something, almost burns down the house, and you say, you give him a lecture, and then the next day he, knocks over one of the fence things, and you beat him and ground him for 2 weeks. I mean, parents are like that at times. I think parents who parent wrong are inconsistent when they deal with this, and so they're being driven by anger at one time and discipline, and another time in sentimentality. Um, but I think that if we're angry, be angry and sin not, which means we have to look at why we're angry and what our anger is going to cause us to do. If we're angry about something that's wrong, or if that anger is about something that's right, but that anger causes us to do something wrong, then that's when anger becomes sinful.
Now, just a quick wrap things up. We're at the end of our time. Can you just give us one big takeaway for the youth, modern day, from your sermon or the verse? If you could have just one takeaway, 1 minute or less, just one real quick takeaway.
Yeah. Well, I think for the young people, my concern has been the kids in the church growing up, and then they go to college. And I've seen it where they just fall into groups and act like them and talk like them. And I think it's driven by sentimentality rather than reason. Unless perhaps they've rejected the gospel, then they're following, or they don't believe this anymore. But I think that the sentimentality aspect is wanting to be liked, wanting to fit in. And if I speak especially in the culture today, all you have to do is say one religion's right and one religion's wrong. You're a hater. Do you want to? But if you do it graciously and they call you a hater, well, then so be it. That's the persecution that comes on Christians. And I think young people need to realize you're going to go away to college or you're going to get a job. When you're speaking for Christ, you got to speak truth, but you have to speak it in love and graciously. And there's going to be blowback in this world for that. And if you're supposed to speak and you don't because you don't want to be treated bad or not liked, then that's where sentimentality is leading you into sin.